The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. David Rolf, who led the fight for a $15 an hour minimum wage, says traditional unions are dead and workers have to invent the next labor movement. Pulitzer Prize winning author Matthew Desmond alerts us to the fact that without stable housing, the entire economy is at risk. And Bill Press talks with Devrone Michael of the Progressive Working Families Party. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. David Rolf of the Service Employees International Union says the traditional labor union is dead and workers have to invent the next labor movement. And we say hello to David Rolf, the president of SEIU 775, the fastest growing union in the Northwest, representing home care and nursing home workers in Washington State and Montana. He is also a national leader in the fight for a $15 an hour minimum wage. David Rolf, thanks so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Happy to be here, Jim.
It's nice to have you with us. You are proposing a radical new system of employee benefits called the shared security system. Tell us how that would work for the millions of independent contractors now working in the gig economy.
Well, first, let me just say, I don't think it's radical. It actually works very much like Social Security or like Medicare or like union benefits work in those sort of industries like construction or Hollywood on Broadway, where people aren't working for the same employer every day. In the construction industry, you might be hanging sheetrock for one project this week, another project next week, and for different employers. But your pension, your employee training, your health benefits are covered because every one of those signatory employers under the collective bargaining agreement pays into a union-administered training fund, pension fund, and healthcare fund. Social Security works the same way. If you have 3 jobs in a single day, they all are supposed to be paying, deducting your share and then paying their share of Social Security that's there for you when you need it and it's time to retire. The idea of a shared security system really takes those sort of prototypes that have been around since the 30s and 40s and expands into the whole notion of employee benefits, and not only for union members, but for anyone who's working in this precarious economy, this gig economy, where you're maybe operating, it could be off an app, it could be through a temporary firm or a labor broker, it could be just hanging your own shingle or putting up your flyer at a coffee shop saying you're willing to walk the dog, do the laundry, run the errands, help someone move. But what all those gigs don't have is any mechanism for accruing benefits, for a variety of reasons. One, they're often very, very part-time and temporary jobs. And number two, if I were to have someone over to my house to walk my dog while I'm at work, it doesn't make sense for me to hire someone for an hour's worth of work and then spend 10 hours myself setting them up on a 401k plan or with health benefits. So Nick Hanauer, my collaborator on this subject, and I have published a couple articles, one in Democracy a couple years ago, one in 2017 on the idea that everyone should have a shared security account. And if we use a fictitious character we call Zoe, and in our article, Zoe works 29 hours a week at a hotel, only 29, because otherwise she'd be eligible for Obamacare employer benefits. Drives for UberX, does some gardening for her neighbors, and works as a temp at a local hospital. And then sometimes, which needs extra cash, rents out her apartment on Airbnb. In this hypothetical scenario, every one of those employers or payers would be required to contribute to a shared security account held in Zoe's name, administered by a not-for-profit benefits organization, not by someone loyal to shareholders or Wall Street, but someone an organization that has sufficient cash reserves, sufficient competency and expertise to really administer those benefits. And they would then figure out how to maximize the benefit to Zoe and her coworkers. But when Zoe changed jobs, quit a job, got fired, moved on to a different city, those benefits would remain hers. And they wouldn't be left like so many millions of hours of vacation every year on the employer's table, where the employer gets to realize the financial benefit. They would actually come with her, regardless of who her employer was at any given day, week, month, or minute.
How many workers are independent contractors or people working for middleman companies that get between the employee and the companies?
About 40% of the American workforce is in some form of non-standard employment. Gig economy, temp economy, subcontracted economy, purportedly self-employed, the wide variety of ways in which employers have frankly sought to get out of their responsibilities to pay taxes and pay for benefits by looking for alternative ways to employ people without truly being their employer.
What forces are behind the dissolution of the traditional employer-employee relationship, and can things be turned back? The doctrine of shareholder value above all, which is, I think emerging as one of the worst ideas in human history, as some folks have said. Really reprogrammed, which is really, it came about through the shareholder revolutions of the 80s and changes in business and economics curriculum that started teaching future executives that their only job was to maximize the rate of return for shareholders. And if that's the case, and you can find someone willing to work for less than, for no benefits or less than standard wages, then and that mentality, it's your job to shrink people's wages, cut their jobs, turn them from full-time into temps or part-time or subcontracted. Now, I think that's a really perverse, amoral way of running an economy. And at the end of the day, it's not just bad for workers, it's going to be bad for the rich in the end as well, because you can't sustain a growing economy where workers have no money and no security. If they don't have money, they're really bad customers. And if they don't have confidence in the future, they're unlikely to do things like take out loans to buy a home or go to school. So I would argue that this sort of shareholder value capitalism that was introduced not at the dawn of time, not by Adam Smith in the 18th century, but really by a handful of Reagan cronies in the 1980s, is really doing harm to the economy. But it's one of the driving factors why every big company is looking to see how many employees can it replace by something that doesn't come with benefits costs. Just last week, we saw a home care on-demand, smartphone app called Home Hero, based in California, go out of business. I'm going to start that again because I screwed up. Hold on. Just recently, we saw a home care company called Home Hero go out of business. And they said the reason they went out of business was because they had to switch to W-2s and they had to pay people's benefits, as if somehow it's the business, somehow it's the workers' fault or the government's fault because these folks couldn't figure out how to run a profitable business and obey the law. So I think we're seeing this pressure from shareholders, pressure from venture capitalists, pressure from, the sorts of CEOs and executives who were trained in this model to say, forget workers, forget the overall economy, forget consumer demand, forget what's right, never forget what I'd like to be treated like if I were on the job. We're going to do this because, quote unquote, we have to. And then, by the way, thanks for the nice, lovely bonus and the stock options. We're not going to be able to get rid of globalization or the transistor or the internet and and it's not bad at the end of the day that the economy is becoming in some ways hyper-specialized and that jobs are becoming micro jobs. That isn't bad in and of itself. What's bad is when people lose economic security as a result. And so I think we're seeing, right now, two big forces pushing back against this. One is the $15 minimum wage movement, which is now responsible for something like 20 million Americans getting substantial pay increases over the last 3 years. And we're seeing this concept of portable benefits, which
if it's adopted in a few places, I think is going to catch on, and people are going to like the idea that once again they can afford to get sick, or they can afford to take a vacation, or if they become temporarily disabled, that they have a revenue stream. All things which the old economy provided that the new economy largely doesn't for wage and hour workers, and which I think we can find some 21st century solutions to without trying to fit the modern technological economy into kind of that round peg into the square hole of the 1950s industrial economy.
And we're speaking with David Rolf, president of SEIU 775, the fastest growing union in the Northwest, representing home care and nursing home workers in Washington State and Montana. Your proposal sounds a lot like the way Social Security works or how universal health care would work. Is it that simple?
Well, it would have been a paperwork nightmare 40 years ago. But in the era of financial technology that lives on your smartphone, no, it would be really simple. So if, let's say you were driving for Uber, let's say you put in half an hour of work one day, and that's all. And, that technology could easily calculate what you were paid, take a percentage of it and redirect it into an account in your name. And meanwhile, you might go on and do something for TaskRabbit, or you might work a shift on the weekend at your cousin's 7-Eleven. Any of those payors could simply have what's likely to be a program, like the computer program that actually pays you and transfers money from their bank to your bank, take a percentage off the percentage of it and, send it to a benefits administrator that you choose. So I'll use an example. If you happen to be a member of the AARP, and if the AARP decided they wanted to go into the benefits business, not only health, but the other forms of benefits, they could end up being the place that your money went because you trusted them and you thought they had a good product. Or if your credit union, your labor union, a other not-for-profit, a professional society you belong to, could all get into the business of becoming benefits administrators, and you could choose in an open enrollment period once a year which one you liked the best, just like a lot of folks now can for their health plans. Now, there are some details that we think are important. We should not have Bob's Benefit Bank open up on the corner and decide that going to off-track betting is the way that they want to invest your retirement savings. So we propose that these portable benefits providers need to be qualified, they need to be regulated, they need to have their own insurance and bonding and licensing, and they, most importantly, have to be not-for-profit organizations with a fiduciary duty to the beneficiaries themselves, not a for-profit with a duty to the shareholders. That way, much like a traditional pension fund operated, where the trustees could get in a lot of trouble if they did irresponsible or stupid things with your money, if you're like the typical, let's say, Uber driver or TaskRabbit or part-time retail worker, and you don't have a lot of personal expertise in how to select a health plan, how to select retirement investments, that's okay, because you've selected someone you trust who is in the profession of making those decisions.
What are the chances of your proposal being enacted into law?
Well, I think we're going to see some state legislatures and perhaps city councils begin to take this up probably in 2017. I don't know that we're going to see any laws passed that quickly, but I think that this emerging gig economy that, although relatively few Americans really work off of their smartphones yet, it's a small number, it's a fast-growing number, but overall in the economy, lots and lots of people work in some form of non-standard and non-traditional employment. And so, we've heard of interest in probably 3 or 4 state legislatures and a couple of city councils. I think it's probably going to take a couple of years for the details to get worked out and political compromises to get made and negotiated out. But, there seems to be a fair amount of energy behind this idea, and I'm optimistic we're going to start to see legislative action on it pretty soon.
Do you think Trump is actually going to bring back good jobs from overseas, or do you think he will drag us all down into another recession or worse?
Well, listen, he's lying when he says the jobs went overseas. That's not where they went. American manufacturing output is at its highest level ever. It's just that 80% of the jobs lost in manufacturing were lost to robots, not to Chinese workers. Certainly there are some specific sectors like clothing, electronics, a lot of what used to be called light manufacturing sectors where jobs went overseas. I don't think that he's going to be able to wave a magic wand and bring them back unless he can somehow convince, lots of Chinese factory workers that they're going to demand American level wages. That'd be good for them and good for us, but I certainly don't see Donald Trump being the one to do it. I think he could cause a recession. If he deports 11 million wage earners, that'll trigger a depression for sure, as all of that spending power and earning power gets sucked out of the economy. Hopefully, even the Republicans in Congress and in his cabinet won't let him go that far, but you never know. Listen, I think that he campaigned on bringing your job back and making America great again, but you look at the people he's hiring and the policies they embrace, and it's sort of like the reverse. You don't make America great again by cutting people's wages, but that's what the Republicans want to do. You don't bring back jobs by eroding worker bargaining power. That will ultimately produce the reverse effect, because if workers don't get paid well, then they don't spend very much. They don't spend very much. They don't create demand for everything from dryers to textbooks to pharmaceuticals to burgers, you name it. If a worker doesn't have money in their pocket, they can't buy any of it. And that means someone else doesn't have a job supplying it, transporting it, selling it, servicing it, et cetera. So I can't figure out why the Republican economic mantra seems to be that the worse that workers do, the better the economy gets. But that's what they seem to believe, and that's what they seem to practice every time they get a chance. So, I don't know what Donald Trump actually believes. I don't know that he knows what he believes about unions or about wages. He's certainly said enough contradictory things that it would be hard to parse out a consistent public policy position from any of his words. But I think it's more likely than anything, when you take the sum total of what his Labor Department will do, what his National Labor Relations Board will do, what this Congress will do, that lives for American workers are going to get worse and not better over the next 4 years.
Given the Uber economy and your proposals for portable universal benefits, does that mean the traditional labor union movement is dead?
Yeah. The traditional labor unions played an incredibly important role. And listen, I'm a union leader. I'm a founder of unions. I'm an organizer of unions. I have done probably as much as anybody to help hundreds of thousands of workers in my lifetime join unions for the first time. And for those Americans who have access to a union, it's an awesome experience. They make $200 a week more than their non-union counterparts. They have a voice on the job, dignity, respect, a contract that sets up the basic terms and conditions of employment, and most hourly wage earners don't have that. The problem is unions have been shrinking since the 1950s, not since Reagan, not since Trump, not since Bush, but all the way back to the early 1950s. And at this point, only 6.4% of private sector workers in the United States has a union anymore. That number keeps dropping. It keeps going down. We don't ever see it go back up, despite 40 years of the best laid plans by union leaders and progressive Democrats. So, yeah, I think that for those workers who still have union representation, they should treasure it and treat those unions well. But in general, I don't see the old form of American trade unionism reemerging. It was state of the art for the industrial economy of the 1930s. And historians in the audience or history students will remember that itself, the industrial unions that got born largely in the 1930s, themselves replaced an older form of craft unionism. And that itself was one of many competing types of labor movement activity in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The idea that unions had to be one size fits all and there was only one model for labor activism was really a pretty new idea, ranging from the heart of the 20th century. So what I think we need in the 21st century is the same things workers needed then. They needed the power to change their lives economically, to earn good wages and benefits. And we need it to happen for millions of workers who don't have that now. And that was what really mattered about my grandfather's automobile workers union, my great-grandfather's distillery workers union, or my mom's teachers union, was those unions changed those people's lives. They brought them into the middle class. And workers today need that more than anything. But I don't think that the failed model of enterprise-based collective bargaining is likely to reemerge suddenly after 60 years of decline. I think our job is harder than that. For unions leaders, for labor leaders, and progressives, we are going to have to invent the next labor movement, something that we can't yet discern, but that has the power to dramatically and disruptively improve workers' lives in the 21st century. That's a hard task, but in some ways it's like when John F. Kennedy gave that moon speech and said, we're going to go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. That's what today's labor leaders and progressive political leaders, I think, need to do, which is we need to invent the next form of worker power, not because it's going to be easy, but because it's necessary.
All right. David Rolf, president of SEIU 775, the fastest growing union in the Northwest, representing home care and nursing home workers in Washington State and Montana. He, of course, is also a national leader in the fight for a $15 an hour minimum wage. David, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Matthew Desmond, a Harvard sociologist, just won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction with his book, Evicted, about the nation's housing crisis. He was a guest when the book was published, and we offer his insights again this week, and we'll hear that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Trump, Trump, Trump. Troops are marching to battle. Boom, boom, boom. Bombs are blowing up communities. Whoosh. Poisonous gas is being released. Forget Syria, ISIS, Iran, Afghanistan. This is Trump's war. Our bellicose commander-in-chief is at war in the homeland, deploying his troops to attack everything from our public schools to the EPA, dropping executive order bombs on Muslim communities in the Mexican border, and spewing poisonous tweets of bigotry and right-wing bile at the media, scientists, inner cities, illegal voters, Meryl Streep, diplomats, Democrats, people who use real facts, and, well, Trump is at war with the American majority, with all who do not agree with him. And you thought Nixon had a long enemies list. Yet, Trump's most destructive assault so far has not targeted any one group, but an essential and existential concept: truth. Bluntly put, he's psychotic, believing that truth is whatever he says it is, and that he can change it tomorrow. Years ago, in a futuristic novel, the author wrote about the rise of a tyrannical regime that ruled by indoctrinating the masses to accept the perverse notion of capricious truth. It was George Orwell's 1984, which depicted a dystopia he named Oceania. There, the public had been inculcated to believe that reality is not, quote, something objective, external, existing in its own right. Rather, whatever the party holds to be truth is truth. Now, in 2017, we live in Trumplandia, with a delusional leader of a plutocratic party trying to redefine reality with alternative facts and fake news. This is Jim Hightower saying, but resistance is already surging, including the fact that Orwell's 70-year-old book has become a bestseller again, thanks to Trump resistors seeking, truth.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. When his startling exposé of the housing crisis hit the bookshelves, we had the author, Matthew Desmond, as a guest. He is now the recipient of a Pulitzer Prize for that exposé, and we are proud to offer an encore interview. And we say hello to Matthew Desmond, Associate Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University and co-director of the Justice and Poverty Project. He is a 2015 MacArthur Genius Grant recipient and author of the new book, Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. Matt Desmond, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And great to have you with us as well. Traditionally, of course, the focus of poverty has really been on jobs, jails, welfare, and public housing. But you say the private housing market is the crux of the problem. Can you elaborate on that?
I started thinking about the link between housing and poverty and tried to get after that link in the old-fashioned way. I moved into really 2 poor neighborhoods in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and started following families getting evicted. And I just saw the private rental market play such an imposing role in their lives. It was consuming most of their income. It was dictating where they lived, who they lived with. It was kind of causing their eviction, homelessness, residential instability. And it just wasn't on the top of our domestic poverty agenda. And, not everyone in a low-income community has a parole officer or a social worker or a pastor. Some don't have employers. But almost all of families in low-income communities have a landlord. And I think we really need to understand the role that housing is playing in deepening and creating poverty in America. We've reached a point today where the majority of low-income renting families nationwide are spending at least half of their income on housing. And 1 in 4 of those families are spending over 70% just on rent and utilities. Under those conditions, housing plays a huge role in kind of crushing families of moderate means.
And so these percentages for poor families today, is that national? I mean, is it worse in some areas than others? I assume it would be. Is that right?
That's right. We do see regional variation, but those are national numbers. If you look at just all renters in the country, not just those below the poverty line, all renters, you learn that 1 in 5 renting households is paying over half of their income on housing. So this is a story that's very acute in expensive cities like Washington, D.C. and Seattle, but it's also a story that's in Houston and Atlanta and Milwaukee and St. Louis. It's a widespread problem.
Mm-hmm. Now, your book reveals that poor people move a lot. Clearly, it's not because they're moving up, at least not the bulk of them, right?
It's a really important point, and I think that a lot of researchers, journalists, policymakers for years have said sentences like this. Low-income families have high rates of residential instability. We've said, low-income families move a lot without explaining why. And I think one contribution of this research on eviction is to show very clearly that low-income families are moving so much simply because they're forced to. They can't afford a roof over their head. We have some statistical evidence that shows that renters in Milwaukee that are below the poverty line do not move more than more affluent renters if you control for eviction. If we want more family stability, community stability, we need fewer evictions.
Is eviction really, has it become an industry almost?
I mean, just like other situations where, business models will pop up when they can. And now we have movers whose full-time job it is to execute eviction moves. We have sheriff departments who have deputies working all day, every weekday, carrying out eviction orders. We have literally hundreds of data mining companies that collect eviction records and sell them to landlords. We have attorneys who specialize in carrying out evictions. So in many different areas of the market, eviction has become something that folks rely on to make a living.
That's kind of scary to think about, because if my job is to do something along those lines, and I imagine sheriff's offices would probably, rather be doing something else, but there are other jobs, clerical jobs, things like that, where you're dealing in this. I don't have any incentive to stop. In fact, I'd like it to keep going because it's putting money in my pocket. How do you work around that?
I don't think that folks that are kind of triaging the eviction epidemic, I don't think they're the ones that are really the root cause of this issue. The root cause of this issue is the fact that incomes for low-income families for the last several decades have remained stagnant, but housing costs all around the country have soared. Between 1995 and today, median rent in America has increased by over 70%. Utilities have increased by over 50% in the 2000s. So you have a rising gap between what low-income working families are bringing in and what they're asked to pay just for a roof over their head. And at the same time, you've had kind of a lack of government assistance to help kind of meet that gap. And I think that most Americans still believe that the typical low-income family lives in public housing or gets some sort of government help when it comes to meeting their housing needs. But the opposite is true. Only about 1 in 4 families nationwide who qualify for housing assistance receive it. And in some of our biggest cities like Washington, D.C., the waiting list for public housing isn't counted in years, it's counted in decades. So, like a single parent that applied for public housing today in our nation's capital is probably a grandparent when his application comes up for review. So those are the 3 ingredients to this issue: flat incomes, rising housing costs, and just kind of the fact that most low-income families don't benefit at all when it comes to housing assistance from any level of government.
We're speaking with Matthew Desmond, Associate Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University, author of the new book, Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. Matt, you focus on Milwaukee, where 1/8 of renters are forced to move. Is Milwaukee typical of the nation?
So in Milwaukee, every 2 years, 1 in 8 renters does have to move from an eviction or informal eviction that doesn't go through the court, some other kind of involuntary move. We have the most comprehensive measure of forced displacement in any American city in Milwaukee. But I've crunched the numbers in Cleveland and Kansas City, Chicago. New York City sees 60 martial evictions every single day. The numbers that we're seeing in other cities are the numbers that we saw in Milwaukee. We know from national data that renting families in over 2.8 million homes think they'll be evicted soon. So this is a book that's definitely set in Milwaukee, but it tells an American story.
Mm-hmm. Besides losing a home, a place to stay, what are the longer-term effects of eviction?
So eviction causes loss. Families lose not only their homes, but their kids lose their schools. They often lose their communities. Eviction comes with a record, a blemish, and we know that, a criminal record can really affect you on the job market, and it can bar you from certain government aid. An eviction record can work the same on the housing market. Many landlords reject anyone with a recent eviction on their name. And so we have evidence that families, after their eviction, they're pushed into worse neighborhoods, they're pushed into worse housing. If we want to know why some families live with lead paint and exposed wires and no heat, one reason is that they're forced to accept those conditions under the harried aftermath of an eviction. Public housing authorities often count an eviction as a blemish against your record, which means we're systematically denying public housing help to families that arguably most need it. We have evidence that eviction causes job loss, and if any of your listeners have gone through an eviction, they know why. It's such a consuming, stressful, drawn-out event. It can cause you to make mistakes at work and eventually lose your footing in the labor market. And then there's the toll eviction has on your mental health, your spirit. And I think that, we have evidence that mothers who get evicted have higher rates of depression 2 years later. We know that suicides attributed to evictions and foreclosures doubled between 2005 and 2010 nationwide. So you step back, right, and you look at all that, you add all that up. And I think what we have to conclude that evictions, which used to be rare in this country and draw crowds, evictions, it's not just a condition of poverty, it's a cause of it. It's making things worse.
What solutions are there, and are possible solutions to at least alleviate this? Do they come locally, or is it something federal? Is it a combination? What can be done?
Many, many, many things. And I think there are exciting things going on at the federal level and the local level to prevent family homelessness and address eviction, preserve affordable housing. I think that we first have to ask ourselves a question, which is, do we believe that housing is a right? Do we believe that access to decent, affordable housing is part of what it means to be an American? We've extended provision in old age, access to 12 years of education, basic nutrition. We've established those things as rights in this country because we believe, human flourishing, economic mobility, they are impossible without those things. And I think it's really, really hard to argue that housing is not central to human thriving and economic mobility. I think housing should be a right for everyone in this country, and the reason is really simple. Without stable shelter, everything else falls apart. So then the question is, okay, how could we deliver on that right? How could we turn this kind of abstract discussion into a concrete reality? And the good news is we have programs today that already work pretty darn well. The problem is they serve a lucky minority of poor families. So if you take our housing voucher program, for example, that serves about 17% of poor renting families, and you expanded that to everyone below the poverty level, making it a universal program, that would fundamentally change the face of poverty in America. It would drive down family homelessness. Evictions could become rare again. Families would immediately feel the income gains because they would get a voucher instead of paying 60 or 70% of their income on housing. They would pay 30%. The voucher would cover the rest, and they could take that voucher and live anywhere they wanted as long as their housing wasn't too expensive or too shoddy. We know from previous research that when families finally receive a housing voucher after years and years on the waiting list, they do one consistent thing with their freed-up income. They take it to the grocery store, and they buy more food, and their kids become stronger and less anemic. But today, the majority of poor families aren't so lucky, and their kids don't get enough to eat because the rent eats first. We in America don't have to settle for that. We have programs that work. We just need a bigger dose.
Okay. Matthew Desmond, Associate Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University. His new book, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City. Matt, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We do look forward to having you back again soon.
Yeah, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much.
And we appreciate your time. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Devrone Michael of the Progressive Working Families Party.
Yes, indeed, the Working Families Party, an alternative progressive party here in this country. Want to find out more about it from senior political strategist Devrone Michael, who joins us here in studio. Devrone, nice to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks so much for having me, Bill.
Yeah, so what is the Working Families Party? How long have you been around, and what's your mission?
The Working Families Party has been around for 20 years. We're an actual third party in 3 states that allow fusion voting, in New York, Oregon, and Connecticut, where you can vote for a candidate on 2 different lines. and 13 other states, we're an independent political organization that works to raise standards for working class people.
So, explain Fusion Party. I've never dealt with that.
Exactly. So in the state of New York, when Hillary Clinton was running for president last year, she was on the working families line and the Democratic line. She got a certain number of votes. If she gets 100 votes for the Democrats and 20 votes for working families, she gets 120 votes. But those 20 people were able to indicate that they voted for specific reasons. Normally it's policy reasons like raising the minimum wage or progressive issues that they care about. And that gives us an opportunity to show those people running on our line that this is very important to this segment of your voters. And therefore that kind of gets into the table to negotiate and work on our issues.
I've heard of that in the past in the sense that on the Republican side, you could be Republican and there's a conservative party too.
Correct.
Is that,
yep.
Yeah, right.
Same.
Three states allow that?
Yep. Actually, 4 states. South Carolina does as well, but no secret, not that many progressives down in South Carolina.
Yeah,
hey, there are a couple, man. It's my home state.
And that's why you're here with me in D.C.
Exactly. That's why I'm not there anymore.
That's right. And so you're on 3 out of 4, and then the other 13 states, you said?
Yeah, we're an independent political organization, so we run candidates. Sometimes they're here recruiting candidates to run as Democrats to support, again, higher minimum wage, paid families, and progressive issues like that. We basically see it as our vision, or our job is to beat the bad Democrats, and it's Democrats' job to beat Republicans.
Yeah. So do you have operate like the major political parties? Do you have a convention? Did you have a candidate for president of your own in 2016?
No, we
no.
Typically
Okay.
through our questionnaire and nominating process, people do interviews with our board, and we'll decide as our membership, which spans the country, about 1 million folks, gets to vote on who they want to endorse. In the primary, our membership voted overwhelmingly to endorse Bernie Sanders. We sent staff all across the country. I myself was on Bernie's African American outreach team and went to 15 states for Bernie. We did a huge amount of work for him. And then just as most folks, once the primary is over, our membership again voted to endorse Hillary Clinton, and we went to work for her as well.
Is your goal to be on the ballot in all 50 states and have your own candidate? Is that what you're moving to?
I think the big vision is simply being a faction of the left on the Democratic Party to make sure the Democrats don't go too far to the middle and stay true to their mission.
Yeah.
Which they seem to have lost over the last 30 years.
Tell me about it.
I want to ask you a question about Barack Obama, because I think that a lot of Democrats are still pining for Barack Obama, especially when you look at the guy that's in the White House now. But Barack Obama, I think his legacy will show that he did a lot of damage by being such a centrist. And I think, especially in retrospect, when you look at how he gave Donald Trump an inch, and then Trump took a mile. When you look at the immigration things, you look at some of our foreign policy and drone warfare and things like that. I think that Barack Obama was so obsessed with just being a centrist Democrat that I think in the end, when we look back, it's probably going to bite him in the butt.
I think, this is my theory on Barack Obama. I think you're exactly right. I think throughout his life, he was so able to be that guy to broker deals and bring folks together that he was beloved most of his career. I think he felt in the White House, he seemed like he wanted to be reasonable. He wanted to reach out because he thought I would bring these guys, they'd love me like everyone else, and they would see that I'm being a fair broker. And he never understood that they hated his guts and would never capitulate to anything for this guy.
Yeah.
I also I don't think it's quite fair to lay the Democratic losses over the last 8 years at his feet. Some significant things changed while he was in office. Of course, Citizens United, redistricting, and of course the gutting of the Voting Rights Act played a large role in losing those 900 some odd state council races or state legislative races over the last 8 years. So again, that was not very helpful. But yeah, you're right. The guy wanted to be left so badly.
Yeah.
And he was definitely a centrist and not a progressive.
I might refer you to a book that came out a couple of years ago on that very topic called Buyer's Remorse.
Written by
enough said.
some guy.
So, as a progressive force in the Democratic Party, you said something a little earlier, certainly, which got my attention, that the Democratic Party has lost its way. In many ways, it has, hasn't it? I mean, and look, I was a big Bernie supporter in the primary, and that was part of the reason. I just thought the party needed a real swift kick in the ass.
Yeah, absolutely. I think again, we made a deal with the devil, as you know, back in the early 90s, where we went courting Wall Street to find the few guys that would be on our side. We lost and forgot that we were the party of unions, a party of everyday working Americans.
A party of working families,
That's
shall
right,
we say, right?
Basically.
Yeah.
It's showing in our policy. It's showing in the way that we go about funding elections, the way we go about building our state parties. And it's we got to get back to basics and win those voters back and make sure that the rising American electorate knows that we have their best interests in mind as well.
But I mean, yeah, from looking from a distance, it was hard to tell the Democratic Party from the Republican Party.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
In terms of where they raise their money, how they went about raising money, and in many cases, what stands they took on issues, and how, or certainly, how hard they were willing to fight for them.
Yeah, I would think that they did not. It wasn't a full-throated embrace of working people. It was like, you know what, I'll be 2 degrees better than that guy, and that'll be enough.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of not enough. The folks in the middle of America are actually literally hurting. There's many reasons they voted for Donald Trump, but if you've driven through the Rust Belt, if you've driven through places like, I went to college in Arkansas, you'll see a lot of places where folks could actually raise a family, make a living with just by the sheer force of their back, can no longer do so. And they see in the population centers that Democrats are paying more attention to places like New York and the Acela corridor here in D.C., and I don't feel that they've been looking out for the little guy in those other places, and that's how Trump was able to exploit that hole and make them feel that, God almighty, P.T. Barnum actually gave a crap about them and their everyday lives.
Yeah. Now, I want to take a wild guess here, and I sort of have a feeling that you might have supported Keith Ellison for the next Democratic chair.
Yeah, Keith's a good friend, and I absolutely supported Keith. But that's it.
How did I know?
I think Tom Perez is a very smart and capable man.
I was going to ask you, so what confidence do you have in Tom Perez as the new chair of the Democrat, that he's going to shake up the party and give the party a total new populist direction?
You're not supposed to ask hard questions, Bill.
That's
I like with most institutions, it's extremely difficult. They're like aircraft carriers. It's difficult to change the momentum and to change the directions of something so large, especially when you have people who are used to being in power for so long. But I do think that Tom wants to change, and I think that Keith will have a good influence on what the world should. I had a chance to sit down with him. He expressed his desire to actually go out and do things a little differently than they've done in the past, and I take him at his word.
Yeah, I think we all, and I'm pleased to see that Senator Sanders is going out on the road with Tom Perez. I think it's this week or next week at any rate. They've got a whole series. They're going to, I don't know how many states, right, to rally up the base and get people, all part of the resistance, to keep them alive, give them a purpose, talk about what we've got to do. So that's a very good sign. I mean, Bernie certainly supported Keith, as we all did, but has confidence in Tom's ability. And also, I think, sort of maybe pushing Tom, a little.
Yeah, absolutely.
Keep going here, Tom. Because it's going to be hard. My concern is it's going to be hard for him to cut the apron strings.
Oh yeah.
When he was running, he came in. He did a great job. He is a big progressive. He's been all of his life, right? Mm-hmm. But he's also part of that Democratic establishment, no doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, labor leader friends of mine who were in Atlanta working for Keith, whipping the vote, they were fighting the fact that while they were whipping the vote, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden were all making phone calls to those delegates telling them to vote for Tom Perez.
Absolutely, which for those of folks who love, clearly those three men are beloved, even by those of us on the left.
Yeah.
Need to wake up and smell the coffee. Those guys are the establishment as they come, and you got to call it what it is.
Yeah.
The Democratic establishment does not know how to speak to gettable voters. Trump got those voters, and Hillary Clinton was the wrong messenger for that. Clearly. And it's not just, I'm not placing it at her feet, but the Democratic establishment has forgotten how to offer those voters a way forward and the best ideas.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And then also, with this last election, there were some very basic things that we simply didn't do.
True.
Because we didn't take him seriously. Like to say that to offer no alternative because he's crazy, but he's offering something.
He's offering something.
What are you offering? Saying that, oh, he's crazy, you'll never do it. It's not a positive message. And we learned from Teddy Kennedy, you got to tell someone why you want to be president. And I could, for the life of me, it was mid-October and I turned to my allies and I cannot make the argument as to why she wants to be president. I haven't heard that yet, and she has not offered something different. And people will believe anything in the absence of any other alternate theory or alternate vision.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, who's the leader of the Democratic Party today? Would you say?
Good question.
It's tough, right?
Absolutely.
That's a tough question.
Let me put it this way: who's the leader of the progressive movement today?
There's clearly Bernie Sanders is the leader of the progressive movement. Would you
But Bernie's an independent.
This is true.
I had this conversation with a reporter yesterday who called me. He's writing a story about Bernie Sanders and said, what do you think about that? He's no longer a Democrat.
And that presents a very unique problem because the primary wounds are still there. They haven't completely healed. And every day, if you're on Twitter, if you're on social media, you see it every day. And it just gets to my craw that people are still arguing about the Democratic primary. We have an existential threat in the White House. A crazy man is running the country, and you guys are complaining about emails and whatever else and Democratic DNC? Yeah. Really?
So I think you have to almost say, I don't know who the leader of the Democratic Party is today either. I don't think there is one. I think one will emerge, maybe. But for now, certainly, to me, a bigger force than the Democratic Party is kind of, roughly speaking, if you will, the resistance, right? The movement.
Yes. And
Bernie's ahead of that. I don't think there's any doubt about that, even though he may be an independent. Yeah, so in a sense, it almost doesn't matter. So where, and you're part of that too, where do you direct people? Where does all this energy go, and how do we, in fact, deliver, if you will, a populist movement and also reshape the Democratic Party?
Right.
Is it midterm elections or what?
It is definitely midterm elections. I would, and before that, we have to fight them on their legislative agenda now, which is one of the most evil and cruel agendas I've seen in quite some time. And the Working Families Party and MoveOn.org and People's Action are actually doing Resist Trump Tuesdays, where we're organizing folks to go into their congressional offices every week, every Tuesday, to do some kind of action.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually been pretty successful. Also, we're doing.
Let me stop you there because I hadn't heard about. I mean, I know about we all know about the Moral Mondays, or at least I do, with the Reverend Barber down in North Carolina, a good friend. But these are Resist Trump Tuesdays.
Yes, definitely. Go to the workingfamiliesparty.org and you can plug right in.
Where do you find out? Workingfamilies.org. Workingfamiliesparty.org. Workingfamiliesparty.org. And so these are people going to members' district offices or whatever, and just showing up and
showing their displeasure during the AHCA. Again, I think that showed that people were actually upset, and I think Republicans were surprised at the pushback they were going to get. Which basically the AHCA was just a big tax cut for the rich, which is why it was such a disaster.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's what it was. As Bernie pointed out, it was a $600 billion transfer of wealth.
Yep. That's how if you cut $900 billion and only saves $300 billion, you do that by giving the $600 billion to the rich white guys. No offense, Bill.
I may be white, but I ain't rich. All right. So the legislative agenda, which will be health care, tax reform, whatever else. You're right. We got to fight that. Anything they try to do through this Congress, and then focus on 2018.
Absolutely, we've got to all guns blazing, all hands on deck, and we have to fight them everywhere. All 50 states, every congressional district, we have to contest all of them to maximize our gains. History shows that the first midterm election after a presidential election, they typically lose seats. This guy is such an unmitigated disaster. We think there could potentially be a wave, and the way we take the most advantage of that is, again, to put quality candidates up in as many seats as possible and then leave no stone unturned.
And we also face redistricting in 2020. So are you also focused on state legislative governor's races, too.
Focus on the state legislative races and definitely the governor's races so that we actually have a seat at the table. Again, during Barack Obama's term, I think we lost more than 900 state seats. I'm not sure we can make that up. And just saying I'm going to go on
you're optimistic,
but not that optimistic. But having the governor's seat, a way to check and to check those processes will be very important to us, and that's how we actually get back into the majority.
Yeah, I mean, it's all related, and that's the basic building block, if you will. Yeah. And one, I think, note of optimism is that more and more people, progressives, are coming out of the woodwork and want to run, for office. I mean, I don't know whether you're finding that, but we've had several people, Emily's List and others who have come in, have said they're just overwhelmed with people now who want to stand up and run for office.
The energy on the street is incredible. We're doing calls every Sunday, and every Sunday between 25 and 60,000 people are joining on to discuss what we're going to do on this following Tuesday. Also, I've done a couple of races across the country.
That's great. Yeah.
And Tashara Jones' race in St. Louis for mayor, and people were coming in, Progressive Coalition, Young White Progressives, young millennials were coming in to volunteer. They were just unsolicited. I've got 2 hours. How do I pitch in? What can I do? And it's again, if we can keep the ball rolling, I think we'll be successful in 2018, heading into 2020.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. David Rolf, Matthew Desmond, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.